Dr. Gilad Isaacs will be presenting on the challenges and opportunities for a new global financial architecture. Dr. Gilad Isaacs is the Executive Director at the Institute for Economic Justice. He's also an economist at Wits University, where he coordinates the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative and lectures. Gilad has a PhD and Master's in Economics from SOAS University of London and a Master's in Political Economy from New York University. He has worked as a consultant for the United Nations International Labour Organization and the Global Labour University. He has a background in civil society activism, working for the Treatment Action Campaign and founding the Social Justice Coalition. His research expertise are in financialization, macroeconomics, and labor markets. I now hand over to our first speaker for this session, Dr. Gilad Isaacs. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Saviwe, and thanks very much to SCIS for the invitation, and Ford and other panelists. I'm conscious that the series attempts to answer both substantive political and analytical questions and to reflect on lessons we have learned in undertaking this work as part of the Ford Foundation's Plus Fund initiative. I'm going to contribute some thoughts on the question, as Saviwe said, of challenges and opportunities for transforming the global financial architecture, knowing that there are many experts here from a political and analytical point of view, whilst utilizing reflections from our work as part of a consortium of the IEJ, OTE, ERO, CEDAS, and CSR as jumping off points in this input. In thinking about this topic, three things struck me, and in looking back on some of our work. First, the question itself of transforming the global financial architecture has become very common and has a broad spectrum of support, at least in rhetoric, across role players. In this week's UN Financing for Development Forum, we saw criticism of the prevailing global financial system from organizations and from civil society movements, the IMF, World Bank, governments, feminist collectives, and a wide range of actors. We even heard the UN General Secretary say that the global financial architecture has failed countries at their moment of greatest need. Of course, not all these actors necessarily mean the same thing. Secondly, it seems that we share a relatively common set of understandings of the dysfunctions caused by the existing global financial system, the massive illicit financial flows, tax evasion, unsustainable private and multilateral debt, a looming debt crisis, private sector capture, insufficient climate finance, and so on. And of course, these manifest most acutely in the global south and disproportionately impact marginalized communities, including like women, minorities, indigenous persons, and so on. Thirdly, it also seems that there's a somewhat shared set of proposals for reforming this financial architecture, including more democratic, transparent, and accountable IFIs, increasing financing on favorable terms, the need for restructuring debt, and so on. And in fact, many of those involved in Ford's initiative are organizations working on these. So, you know, instead of sort of treading these sort of shared areas, I set myself possibly a a task beyond that which I shouldn't have, but in an attempt to say something new, or at least something which raises new questions, I wanted to think about a systemic analysis of the financial architecture, one which looks beyond the commonly shared understandings of the dysfunctions which it causes and the somewhat shared policy reforms, and to use that systemic analysis to unpack opportunities, challenges, and organizing for a change. So that's where we're going. The main example which I'd like to use in doing this is two recent crises, which I think offer a fulcrum for our conversation. In March of this year, colleagues might recall there was a run on an American bank, the Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, where depositors attempted to withdraw financing from that bank. In response, the US Federal Reserve set up a new lending facility, expanded its balance sheet by about 300 billion, and provided assurances that uninsured depositors would be made whole. And this reached beyond just SVB. As that turmoil spread across the Atlantic, we saw the impact on the Swiss bank Credit Suisse, which seemed on the edge of financial implosion. The Federal Reserve reactivated its international dollar swap lines, which provide US dollars to European allies. The Swiss authorities wrote amendments to the existing law to allow for a UBS merger, and offered a publicly guaranteed backstop. So this injection of liquidity and this swift maneuvering, which we see in that crisis, finds its mirror opposite in the looming debt crisis of the developing world, in which we see at least about 52 developing countries either distressed or on the verge of being so. Now, in some ways, this is a similar crisis. These countries are not necessarily over-indebted per se. Some countries, the emerging market average debt levels is below its historic highs, and inflation might eat into that. The problem which many countries face is one of liquidity. Prohibitively high interest rates have made it difficult for these countries to access new financing or roll over existing loans. Now, the primary provider of financing in this instance is the IMF. And in contrast to the other crisis, what we've actually seen from the IMF is one, that lending is slower than it was. Two, that it is costly, with fees and surcharges being the IMF's single largest source of revenue. And three, that the IMF is overly concerned with restructuring debt in a manner which protects private creditors. So these contrasting examples, which I first read in an excellent article by Professor Mona Ali, illustrates, I think, some salient features of the global financial system and the systemic features. first of these, which I think in civil society work we sometimes emphasize less, is the manner in which the global financial architecture is established to protect the interests of private finance capital or a global financial elite through various forms of bank bailouts or ensuring that sovereign lending is repaid even if it means crippling austerity. Now, these same interests are served by other features, for instance, tax evasions, illicit like financial flows, and so on. So, the global financial architecture serves to, in an age of neoliberal, financialized, finance-led capitalism, protect the accumulation of capital and finance capital in particular. An excellent theorization of this is Gabora's Wall Street consensus, where she argues essentially that there's 10 policy tenets analogous to the Washington consensus, which essentially serve to utilize public funds to de-risk investment opportunities and create the conditions for private financial investment, in particular by large institutional investors and in areas we would traditionally consider unprofitable public goods like infrastructure. And in fact, we've seen a prime example of this in our own work in South Africa, which is the recent Just Energy Transition Partnership, a $8.5 billion financing deal between South Africa, the US, UK, Germany, and the European Union, and the associated investment plan, which is attached. And this is meant to provide South Africa with funds for decarbonizing. Now, our work reflects a number of perverse outcomes here. Firstly, that approaching climate finance in a bilateral way rather than through a transparent multilateral system entrenches global north, global south power inequities. Second, that the composition of this financing is unfavorable, with a small fraction in grants and most in a de-risking private investment framework. Third, that it reinforces a privatized or a PPP model of energy systems. Fourth, that it might worsen South Africa's fiscal position. Fifth, that it will fail to raise insufficient funds. Sixth, that energy poverty may be exacerbated through the increased cost of energy provision to secure private profit, opposed to energy as a public good. I forget what number I'm on now, but the erosion of democratic accountability and the fact that it reinforces a capital-intensive and financialized growth path. Now, these are the obstacles and the learnings which we've seen in this work. But this is all being done in the interest of securing profitable private profitable opportunities for private investment along the lines of a Wall Street consensus. And it's important to note that this has very real material consequences. This deal leaves out, for instance, the creation of employment for those displaced from coal-reliant industries. It leaves out the offering of social security to those workers or to the communities in which they are embedded. And so the first illustration from these examples, which I'm drawing out on a systemic level is the functioning of this architecture to secure private financial accumulation. The second is, and this is sometimes seen as a technical facet of the system, is the centrality of the US dollar, okay? In both cases of these crises, which I mentioned, liquidity was offered in US dollars. And we know that the US dollar functions as world money, as a global unit of account, i.e. to see who owes who what, as a global means of exchange to buy and sell, and as a global store of value. And it is this dollar hegemony which arguably holds and glues the global financial architecture together. Most debt, for instance, is denominated in that way, which lays the basis for balance of payments crises. Now, in line with what I was saying before, this also has a class character, and it's important to understand this in our work that works towards transforming the financial architecture towards an equitable and sustainable economy. And essentially, these pools of offshore dollars exist for two main reasons. The first is in funding trade. And in this instance, developing countries who need to build up a reserve of US dollars are often forced into a situation where they attempt to sell more into the market than they are purchasing in order to build up that US dollar surplus. This often leads to a suppression of domestic wages in order to maintain global competitiveness. The second driver of these large offshore pools is wealth inequality and outsized corporate profits, where large corporations, pension funds, wealthy individuals essentially hold dollar-denominated liquid assets in this shadow banking system. And this, whilst has legitimate purposes, also facilitates tax evasion, corruption, and so on. Okay, I don't think I'm going to go into that in detail. But what I want to emphasize here is that the utilization of the US dollar in this sense has real consequences for workers and global South countries. And often I think what's observed in the work of civil society is a focus on institutional reforms, for instance, a more democratic set of IFIs, but at the exclusion of an analysis of these other types of systemic issues within the architecture. There is currently a drive by global South governments to form a multipolar currency system. And whilst these debates of de-dollarization are extremely complex, we have indeed seen countries like China, India, Russia, and others facilitating trade and financial arrangements in other countries. We also heard President Lula, for instance, reaffirm a call for the BRICS countries to dollarized trade. What this means, and if it is possible, is contested, but I'm going to leave that aside. The issue here is that I think it's very important that for those of us engaging in looking and analyzing the global financial architecture to interrogate what these systemic features and contestations mean. The third lesson from my examples above relate to the functioning of this architecture. And in fact, both crises are a result of a similar set of events, or at least are in part a result of a similar set of events within that. And that in particular is the increased interest rates in the US. In the SVB case, this eroded the value of their assets in US Treasury, weakened their balance sheet. In the developing countries instance, we saw that this meant that it made new borrowing in US dollars expensive, led to pressure on currency depreciation, and forced countries to use expensive reserves up to about 380 billion last year to defend currencies. And so the functioning of this architecture is playing out in a range of ways which might look like they aren't connected. The fourth lesson, and then I'm aware that my time's ticking away, is that we shouldn't overestimate the planned or fixed nature of this architecture. In fact, the system has in part evolved in an unplanned manner, with new layers being added as and when it is needed. And we see that, for instance, both in the novel actions taken in response with the banking crisis, and, for instance, in the illogical absence of a multilateral framework for sovereign debt restructuring. And in fact, whilst there are powerful actors entrenched in the status quo, what this means is that the system itself is contingent. And in fact, the system has evolved, particularly during moments of crisis. The Bretton Woods system, for instance, was built in World War II. The floating exchange rates came out of the economic turmoil of the 1970s. The expansion of sovereign bond markets in the developing world followed the debt crises of the early 1980s, and new instruments like the reserve dollar swap lines emerged out of the 2007-8 financial crisis. So what we see is that conservative forces have been highly effective in using crises to construct a global financial architecture which systemically advances financial elites. And we must also think how to. So I'm going to use my last few minutes now to turn to what this means for implications for action. I've by no means covered all salient features of the global financial architecture. And what I've tried to do is point to where I think some blind spots are in the work which civil society activists, researchers are engaged. As I said at the outset, there is sometimes a common shared understanding of the dysfunctions and reforms needed. And I've tried to probe through these examples some other salient features. So I think this has 5 broad implications. And some of this comes also out of the learning exchange which our consortium undertook. The first is the need to center private finance within our analysis and as a target of our advocacy. We need to make clear the material impacts of private financial accumulation for the reality of communities experienced on the ground. An example of the potential of deepening energy poverty in the context of JETP, which I mentioned earlier, is an example. We need to interrogate how our traditional targets of advocacy, IFIs, multilateral forums, and so on, advance the interests of private finance. We need to interrogate the ways in which private finance and financial markets must be regulated. We need to think about how we target private financial institutions in our advocacy and how this integrates with other facets of our work. Secondly, we need to more deeply interrogate the systemic features and operations of the global financial system, including the role of the US dollar, the implications of this, and the resistance to it for global South countries, workers, and traditionally marginalized groups. For instance, an immediate sovereign debt relief might not be lasting if developing countries are continuously forced by the prevailing system to access dollar financing and accumulate dollar reserves in order to be a participant in the global economy. Third, the critical work on institutional reforms, for example, the governance of IFIs, and the work on regulatory reform, for example, on a global tax agreement, could be more rooted in a political economy analysis of these global power relations. And I acknowledge I've only partially illustrated those. This is not to say that much of the excellent work which is being done hasn't got that, but I think we should be cautious about finding ourselves in a position where where technically sound proposals don't land and aren't effective because of these power relationships. Fourth, I think we must guard against policy proposals that might inadvertently reinforce a perverse global financial architecture. For instance, I support calls for an expanded SDR, special drawing rights issuance from the IMF and a revision of how those are allocated. But we must also consider the position of the IMF in a dollar system with an existing system of reserve holdings, and think to ourselves what other reforms might be needed simultaneously to ensure that a policy like an expansion of SDRs is systemically transformative. And fifth, while I don't think we should engage in armchair sort of grand planning. And whilst alternative systems are often built in the process of struggle, it is worthwhile to think broadly beyond the individual or collection of policy proposals to what a fair and equitable global financial architecture might look like. This, I think, needs to occur on the level of a paradigm and in practice. In a paradigm is about a shared conceptual framework. For instance, our consortium has been thinking about a rights-based global financial architecture. In practice, this means thinking about how the excellent proposals being advanced add up to a new system and what might be being missed from those in order to be building a new system. With those reflections, I'm going to end. As I say, I have hope I haven't skipped over a range of important manifestations of the global financial architecture, but I wanted to try and think what it means to do a deeper systemic analysis and what implications this might have. I look forward to everyone's engagement. Thanks very much.